Shabbat Shalom. When I was in Dallas in July visiting my mom, I came across signs for something called Texit, a formal organized movement by Texans for Texas to secede from the United States again. It had already done so in 1861. I don't know if they study that in Illinois history class, but in Texas, we are indoctrinated with this early and often as it happens. And I found this so Texas and therefore so odd until I did a little research and learned that based on recent polls over the past year since 2024 began, nearly 50% of both Democrats and Republicans across the United States seriously believe secession is a good option for wherever it is that they live. So not just Texas, everywhere. It appears that at the heart of the matter, we have a real trust problem with one another. In 1972, nearly 60% of Americans said that most people are trustworthy. That number today is more than halved. Young respondents are particularly mistrustful. In 2019, 73% of those under 30 agreed that, quote, most of the time, people just look out for themselves, and almost as many said, quote, most people would take advantage of me if they got the chance. And of its many negative effects, such a pervasive sense of mistrust fosters an overheated political climate. Know anything about that? Where everything is at stake, but nothing gets accomplished because so much of the effort is defensive. It also encourages a constitutional crisis. If the other side is morally unacceptable and dangerous, supporting extreme efforts to keep it out of power become more realistic and considerable. It's not overly dramatic to suggest a direct correlation between the collapse of trust and the increasing likelihood of a collapse of democracy. And lest you believe that I am speaking in code about one side or the other, believe me when I say that all sides are complicit. Since the start of July, I cannot tell you how many of you, some of you are here, have sent me emails and letters expressing your urgent concern with those on the other side for their ignorance, their entitlement, their moral bankruptcy, holding not the elected officials responsible, but rather our fellow Jews responsible for the concerning reality in which Jews now find themselves here in the United States, in Israel, and around the world. These letters often invoke closing phrases like, and these are direct quotes, clearly, Jews who vote that way don't care about Israel, the Jews, our history, or our future. Quote, I don't know how any Jew who votes that way can look at themselves in the mirror. Quote, if something isn't done to stop them, I'm afraid never again will lose all its meaning. The communications are eerily similar to one another, except for one part. The object of the blame switches from left to right, Democrat, Republican, this candidate, that candidate, depending on the individual and whomever they prefer, and project the opposite to be nothing less than evil. Ultimately, though, all of this, in my view, boils down to something called motive asymmetry. The all too common phenomenon assuming that we operate from pure motivations, while the motivations of others are nefarious. But of some consolation, perhaps, is the fact that this condition is not modern or new. In this week's Torah portion, we find our ancestors in the 40th year of their wandering, finally preparing to cross into the promised land. The plan is they're going to cross over, they're going to conquer the land, and then they're going to settle in it. That said, 2.5 of the 12 Israelite tribes, Reuben, Gad, G-A-D, not G-O-D, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, ask if they can settle outside of the land, in the lands just on the other side of the Jordan River, because as ranchers and cattlemen, they are literally Jewish cowboys, that land proves better for their needs. Moses' initial reaction to their request is one of rage and fury, as he assumes that they are not only maligning the promised land, but also that they're attempting to shirk their duties from the impending war that's about to happen. By hanging back across the river, they're not going to help their brothers in the conquest of the land, in the fulfillment of the promise. But a deeper conversation then opens where it becomes clear that these 2.5 tribes still intend to fight with the whole people, and only after everyone else is settled in the land will they return to their settlement outside of it. Have you heard that part of the story before? Some of you are perhaps familiar with it, some of you not so much. Either way, that is actually the more popular part of the story. The next part proves much more obscure, but I think much more telling. Our Bible continues after the Torah ends into the books of the prophets, as our story continues once the Jewish people cross over and settle into the land. And then in the book of Joshua, when the Israelites finally do conquer the land, these 2.5 tribes in question do, after they keep their word, settle outside, away from the rest of Eretz Yisrael. Some time passes, everyone's living in their separate communities in their own ways, but then rumors begin to fly. Reports come back to Joshua that these proto-diasporic tribes have built an illegal altar to a different god. This is a big no-no. Everyone knows this is idolatrous treachery. And as such, the 9.5 tribes settled in the promised land, where they were supposed to be after all, take up arms and prepare to go to war against their treacherous brethren on the other side. But before going into an all-out attack, thankfully, the Israelites decide to send an emissary from amongst themselves to speak with the tribes on the other side of the Jordan. And who do they pick? They pick a man named Pinchas. Heard of Pinchas? He was featured in last week's Torah portion. He is a zealot, and probably most famous for zealous passion in seeing fellow idolatrous Jews, or Jews who are idolatrous, and killing them. That's what he's known for. Not a particularly peaceful or measured guy. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of assuming he knows their intent, Pinchas, of all guys, Pinchas goes to the tribes and he does something pretty revolutionary. He asks them about their intentions with the altar that they've built. And interestingly, how do these 2.5 tribes respond? They're mortified to hear that anyone would assume their altar was for other gods. In fact, they cry out to God, oh my God, literally in the Torah, similar to how we might feel if we were accused of betraying our own. And they go on to explain that they built the altar to the God of Israel as a testament to their loyalty since they lived so far away. And here's the real kicker. They explain that their altar was to serve as a reminder, in particular, to their children who would be born outside of Eretz Yisrael, so they would know the people and the God to whom they belong, regardless of where they live. Their action was actually intended to be one of solidarity. But had Pinchas the zealot not taken the time to ask them, who knows how the story would have turned out? Pinchas is a complicated character in the Torah, but it's of real note, I think, that our biblical texts use this former zealot as a model for genuine curiosity about the stories, motivations, and explanations of others. This reminds us that simply asking other people about their own motivations, their own explanations, even the most zealous among us, can allow time and perspective to respond to real information, avoid misunderstanding, and ultimately engender solid and even positive relationships across division. Real encounter, not assumption, not Facebook postings, not letters to your rabbi, but encounter is the requirement. I recently read an article by Duke law professor Jedediah Britton Purdy, where he addressed this very issue, asking what steps we normal people can take to contribute toward the creation of a healthier trust in our country. He wrote the following: Americans need ways to see one another more charitably and also to see politics more clearly. Every partisan knows the sense of threat that today's political environment can trigger. Seeing a car with a bumper sticker from the other side cut you off in traffic, stopping for gas somewhere you suspect everyone is on the hostile team, feeling your way through a first conversation with a dozen political tripwires. Ironically, it is impossible to practice politics if we reduce one another to our partisan identities. We need to practice non-defensively meeting serious disagreement and still proceeding to see the rest of the human being. Another distinction between personal and political trust that we need to learn involves living with sharp moral disagreement. Politics is about coexistence with disagreement around fundamental issues. If we treat moral disagreement as proof of moral badness and as a reason effectively to cut off civic as well as personal relationships, politics is over. It's done. Politics is a relationship we can't escape, for better or for worse. We can poison it, though, and that's what we've been doing. No one's faith, lived experience, or personal truth is exempt from the burdens of conversation. At its best, sustained conversation wins converts in both directions. And more importantly, it can transform moral horror at someone disagreeing with you into trust that people who disagree can also listen, reflect, do things together. I've said it before, all violence begins in disconnect. With the disintegration of relationships where people are left on one side or the other, each side perceiving the other as morally anathema, violence will increase, and what always follows, always, if we listen to history, is war. This is what is at stake, and in many ways, it's already happening. At the end of the day, our greatest agency comes not from the politicians for whom we vote, but from how we navigate through our relationships with one another, our fellow human beings with whom we share this thing called life. This is the place where the seeds of trust can be replanted. And that work is the reserve of each and every one of us. And we will choose to do it or we won't. The truth is, that desire to avoid encounter with one another, to cut ourselves off from one another, to secede from one another, it's powerful. And it's easier It's easier to live our lives surrounded only by those who see things the way we do, believe things the way we do. But the problem is, in the end, that kind of separation does not lead to a stronger, better existence. It has just the opposite result. It weakens everyone. Our only chance of coming out on the other side for the better rests in our willingness to encounter one another in all of our diverse perspectives, face to face. The Jewish theologian Emmanuel Levinas teaches this. The face, seeing the face of another, resists possession, resists my powers. The face speaks to me, and it is the face that invites me into a relationship. By truly facing me, the other puts me in question and obliges me. For in front of the face, I will always demand more of myself. We don't just strengthen one another when we open our hearts to one another. We strengthen ourselves. And these days, strength for ourselves, strength for one another, unity amidst our diversity together, we need it. May it be so. Shabbat Shalom.